June 6, 1944, Normandy Beach. A Sherman tank took a direct hit, and the crew was forced to abandon it. The mission seemed over, except for one man who refused to leave. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, Jr. of the U.S. Army's 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron wasn't an engineer, had no special training, just one crazy idea, some scrap metal, and a welding torch. His commanding officer called him insane. But what he built in 48 hours changed the entire invasion. One broken tank, one stubborn mechanic, and one invention so simple it was genius. So much so that General Omar Bradley, commander of the First Army, ordered it installed on hundreds of tanks before Operation Cobra. This is a story you won't find in history books. The story of the sergeant with a welding torch who saved the Normandy landing. Stay to the end, because what happens next shocked the entire world. Normandy, France, June 1944. 6 days after the landing, the Allied forces were supposed to be over 30 miles inland by now, but instead they were stuck just a few kilometers from the beach. Not because of German tanks, not because of artillery, but because of dirt walls. The French called them bocage, thousands of ancient earthen and stone hedgerows, 3 or even 4 meters high, with roots so thick they were hard as concrete. For centuries, Normandy farmers had built them to divide fields, but now those same barriers had turned the countryside into a natural fortress. For the Allies, each wall was a deadly trap. When American Sherman tanks tried to climb over, their noses tilted up, exposing the underbelly, the weakest armor. One shot from a Panzerfaust or Panzerschreck, and the tank exploded in seconds. 1 round, 4 lives. Day after day, Cullen saw the same thing. Shermans bursting into flames trying to cross the hedgerows, black smoke rising over the Normandy fields, and crews rarely surviving. Medics overwhelmed, tank units exhausted, the advance stalled. Day by day, hour by hour, blood was spilled because of things no one expected: dirt, stone, and roots. Cullen wasn't an engineer. He had no fancy degrees or military academy training. Before the war, he was just a mechanic in New Jersey, fixing cars and trucks in his small shop. But he understood machines. He knew force, leverage, and how materials push against each other. And when he saw yet another Sherman burn trying to cross a hedgerow, he whispered, "It's not the hedgerows that are winning. We're just fighting them the wrong way." Curtis Cullen wasn't an engineer, nor a trained inventor. He was just a mechanic from Company C, 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Regiment, part of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. Before the war, he worked in a garage in New Jersey, more familiar with the smell of oil and the screech of engines than the whiz of bullets. But amidst the blood and smoke of Normandy's fields, that very experience saved an entire army. He saw a problem no one else noticed. Tanks didn't need to climb over the hedgerows. They needed to cut through them. If they could slice through the thick earth, rock, and tangled roots instead of riding over, they would never expose their vulnerable underbellies. The challenge was turning a 30-ton tank into a beast that could smash through earthen walls like plowing through mud. The idea didn't come to Cullen in a briefing room. It came on the battlefield. He pulled out a small notebook he always carried in his breast pocket and began sketching. A few comrades saw him hunched over drawing while bombs echoed in the distance and just shook their heads. "Cullen's at it again," they joked. "This time he's going to fix the whole war with a pencil?" But Cullen didn't care. He knew big ideas often start with crazy ones. That night, he brought the sketches to Captain James A. Van Fleet, his unit commander. He pitched the idea plainly. Salvage scrap steel from destroyed German anti-tank obstacles, cut and weld them into sharp prongs, and mount them to the front of a Sherman tank. As the tank charged the hedgerow, the prongs would dig in, rip through the dirt and roots, and carve a path forward, without the tank tilting upward. Van Fleet looked at the drawings, then looked at Coulon like he was listening to a madman. "You're telling me to let you take a tank, weld junk metal to the front, and drive it straight into a dirt wall thicker than a bunker?" "Yes, sir," Cullen replied calmly. "If I'm wrong, we lose a tank that's already broken. If I'm right, we could save hundreds more." Van Fleet was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. "You have 48 hours. Do it." By the next morning, Coulon had assembled a small team, a few engineering soldiers, a welder, and a Sherman that had sustained only minor damage in the last fight. They walked along the Normandy shore, where steel X-shaped barriers, called Czech hedgehogs, still lay scattered, once placed by the Germans to stop Allied landing craft. The steel was thick, heavy, and strong, but perfect for Coulon's idea. Under the dim Normandy sun, the soldiers began cutting, grinding, welding. The hiss of torches mixed with the distant rumble of artillery. The scent of burning metal filled the air. They worked through the day and night. Coulon didn't rest. Sweat and iron dust clung to his shirt. By the second morning, they had something that looked like a pair of giant horns welded to the nose of the Sherman. A few passing soldiers chuckled. "Looks like a steel rhino." Coulon just smiled. "If it gets through that wall, you can call it whatever you want." Van Fleet came to inspect. He walked around the strange-looking Sherman, tapped on the welds, and said, "All right, Sergeant. Now all you have to do is prove it doesn't blow up when it hits the wall." That night, Coulon couldn't sleep. He sat beside the Sherman, staring at the faintly glowing welds under the moonlight. He believed in physics, believed in the strength of steel. But this wasn't just a test. These were people's lives. If it failed, not just him, but everyone inside that tank could die. He looked at the sharp steel prongs and whispered, "Don't let me down." On the morning of the test, Normandy's fog wrapped everything in a gray veil, the distant sound of roosters drowned out by engines and the low murmur of soldiers preparing. Coulon stood beside the modified Sherman, his jacket stained with iron dust and grease. 4 black steel prongs jutted out front like horns, sharp, crude, faintly gleaming in the dim light. Around him were varied faces, stern officers, curious young soldiers, and a group of tired but hopeful welders. The smell of acetylene and burnt metal mingled with the morning's cold dampness. Captain Van Fleet stood slightly back, hand resting on his coat edge, eyes scanning every weld. "Are you sure, Coulon?" he asked, not to challenge but to share the weight of the decision. Coulon choked up for a second, glanced at the prongs where he had just marked a 15-degree angle in chalk, then nodded. Only one way to find out. The crew boarded, Mitchell at the driver's seat, Harrison adjusting the gun sight, Chen checking comms wires, and sealed the hatches like men entering a ritual. When the V8 engine roared to life, the whole machine vibrated like a beast awakened. That sound silenced every voice around it. The Sherman rolled slowly toward the chosen bocage, a thick wall of earth and tangled roots, a mass that multiple teams had tried to blow up, dig through, or pull apart with no lasting success. The gap closed in. Inside the tank, the smell of hot oil, leather seats, and tension mixed together. Coulon bent low, eyes locked on the path of the prongs. In his mind, every calculation spun: impact force, track torque, load distribution. Thinking of the Shermans that had burned before, he forced his pulse to calm. "Throttle up," he shouted into the mic, and the Sherman surged forward like a rolling steel missile. The first impact sounded like thunder. Earth exploded, roots snapped. The ground itself seemed to screech in protest. For a moment, it looked like the tank was being swallowed by the hedge. Onlookers held their breath. A few hearts nearly burst. But then, the prongs did their job. Instead of making the tank bounce up and expose its belly, the prongs tore deep, boring through roots and stone, creating leverage that shoved the entire wall aside. The treads groaned, the engine strained, and inch by inch the Sherman crept forward, not climbing the hedge, but slicing through its body, staying low with the frontal armor always facing the enemy. Dirt and rock flew like a curtain. The scent of wet soil and burnt metal filled the air, and then, like a wall ripped apart by a giant blade, a hole appeared wide enough for multiple tanks. As the dust cleared, a roar of cheers erupted. Soldiers grabbed each other, waved their arms, shouted, a raw, honest reaction. Mitchell popped the hatch, stepping out with a grin wider than anything seen on his face during the campaign, eyes still lit from the adrenaline. "We barely felt the hit inside," he shouted, his voice still smoky. Harrison pointed toward the main gun. "That position. They didn't even get a shot off." Van Fleet walked up, placed a hand on Cullen's shoulder, and his voice cut through the cheers. "Sergeant, you just did something no one thought possible." Cullen just stood there, drained of all tension. He knew one successful test on a training field wasn't the same as real battle. But this moment gave hope. Hope that the next Shermans wouldn't end up as ashes. Immediately, Van Fleet radioed headquarters, a short, dry report that carried historic weight. Device works, expand trials, request more weld teams. The news spread like wildfire. Cullen didn't linger to celebrate. He went right back to inspecting the welds, checking the prongs for stress cracks, tightening bolts, adjusting angles if needed. Welders began jotting notes, copying every tiny detail: weld angles, prong length, how joints were reinforced to the tank frame, details that would later become part of technical manuals. But with success came practical worries. If the prongs were too high, the tank might tilt and expose its belly. Too low, and they'd just churn dirt without cutting roots. If the welds weren't strong enough, the prongs could snap in battle. Cullen quietly thought through all of it, the weight of not just the invention, but the lives depending on it. He scribbled quick notes in his small notebook, marking the next improvements to test. Adding a central prong for thicker hedgerows, installing shields to protect welds from small arms fire, developing a self-cleaning mechanism for when straw or debris clung to the blades. In his mind, the tactical problem became a to-do list of engineering tasks, and that was the path from a crazy idea to a mass-producible weapon. That morning, the Normandy sky hung heavy with leaden clouds. In a field near St. Lo, the Sherman rhinos lined up, silent like iron beasts awaiting the order. In the distance, German artillery smoke curled upward, thick with the stench of gunpowder and scorched earth. American infantry crouched behind the tanks, their eyes filled with a mix of anxiety and hope. They had seen too many comrades killed trying to cross the Bocage walls barehanded. This time it would be different. This time, they had Cullen's rhinos. Cullen wasn't at the front that day. He was further back, in a field workshop, still directing welding teams to outfit more tanks. But his invention was about to be trialed in real battle, where there were no second chances. The order came. The Sherman rhinos roared to life in unison. V8 engines thundered, blending with the rumble of gunfire. A commander shouted through the radio, "Advance! Smash through!" And then, tons of rolling steel surged forward. At about 30 meters from the Bocage, German guns opened fire. Explosions lit up the field, earth and stone flinging upward like rain. But this time, the Shermans didn't stop. They accelerated, Cullen's razor-sharp steel prongs ramming directly into the thick dirt. A high-pitched screech rang out, and then the bocage walls burst apart like paper. Dirt, roots, and debris erupted into choking clouds. As the smoke cleared, German soldiers stood frozen. The American tanks had pierced straight into the heart of their defenses through what was thought to be impenetrable. In those few chaotic seconds, every German advantage collapsed. The Sherman Rhinos held their low posture, frontal armor still aimed dead ahead, main guns blazing. 75mm shells exploded in dugouts. German troops scattered. U.S. infantry followed, pouring through the breach. In less than 10 minutes, the first Bocage line, where the Allies had been stalled for weeks, was shattered. Then it happened faster than any prayer. As the dust thinned, a scream tore from the front. Panther, a half-visible shape emerged, turret slowly swinging like a cornered predator. The distance was too close for mercy. Inside the Rhino, every sense sharpened. Mitchell felt each tremor through the steering. Harrison gripped the trigger like a lifeline, and Chen muttered calculations about speed and inertia. A shell from the Panther slashed the air, trailing flaming mud, shaking the Sherman's windshield nearly to the breaking point. Splinters of wood fluttered outside. But the Rhino had made the breach, and that was all the crew needed. Harrison aimed, compensating for short-range arc. The charge fired, and the Sherman round slammed into the Panther's side. A massive explosion rocked the tank. The Panther's turret jolted violently. Smoke and fire burst skyward. The stunned German crew bailed out, hands raised. The battlefield paused for a breath, then exploded into shouts, cheers, and scattered retaliatory fire. Not everything was perfect. One Rhino took a hit to its weld shield. Sparks flew, the air filled with the smell of hot steel and burning oil. A gunner was slightly injured, one track damaged by shrapnel, but no tank was destroyed. The infantrymen, worn down and terrified, now surged through the breach like a burden had been lifted. They cleared gun nests, lobbed grenades into bunkers, turning the Rhino-made gap into a solid assault corridor. At HQ, the message came swiftly and without ceremony. Bocage breached, firepower effective, immediate mass deployment requested. Field welding teams were ordered to the front lines. Beach scrapyards were combed for usable steel. In the rear, officers began drafting quick install manuals, supply lists, and emergency maintenance protocols. Because they knew, to capitalize on this, the Rhino had to be scaled fast and strong. In that moment of weary victory, soldiers looked at one another with a new kind of belief. A hope that these steel rhinos wouldn't just break down fences, but pull them out of the deadly maze of Bocage, one gap at a time, one chance to live. Just weeks after the Battle of St. Lo, Curtis Cullen's invention was no longer about a single Sherman. It had become a field innovation spreading rapidly across the Normandy front. What began as a few crudely welded prongs made from scrap metal quickly gained traction the moment battlefield reports showed the results. Tanks breaching hedgerows safely, infantry following without being trapped in kill zones. Mid-level commanders issued orders immediately. Scale up now. Field welding teams were set up in canvas depots, open lots, even abandoned greenhouses. Welders, mechanics, engineers, and infantry joined forces to scavenge steel from German beach obstacles, cutting, grinding, and welding the prongs to spec. From Saint-Lô to Caen, Carentan to Avranches, Sherman rhinos could be seen hugging the front lines, their steel tusks ripping through earth and roots, carving walking corridors and supply routes once paid for in blood. No longer a test, the Rhino quickly became essential equipment. New crews were trained on how to approach hedgerows at the optimal angle, how to steer to drive prongs deep without exposing the tank's belly, and how to react when the prongs got stuck. Installation and maintenance guides were printed, copied, and passed from depot to depot. In just days, field logistics hubs had standardized procedures for turning enemy scrap into Allied breakthroughs. Logistics, no less crucial, adapted swiftly. Rear depots and workshops were ordered to prioritize steel, leaf springs, and welding gear. Pallets, steel baskets, and mounts were quickly manufactured to move prongs efficiently. Transport engineers designed fastening methods to avoid damage during bumpy hauls. Logistics officers wrote new handbooks. Welding lines had to run 24/7. Supply points were repositioned just far enough from the front to stay safe, but close enough to keep pace with the assault. It wasn't a glamorous shift, but it turned a sergeant's brainstorm into a battlefield-scale weapon. Tactically, the Rhino flipped the bocage problem inside out. Where hedgerows once nullified Allied armor, they now became only temporary obstacles. Once a Sherman Rhino breached a hedge, its main gun and machine guns could instantly suppress enemy firing positions. Infantry filled in the breach. Supply and motor convoys surged forward, shifting momentum. In Operation Cobra at the end of July, hundreds of Rhinos led the charge. Previously impenetrable lines collapsed in days, paving the way for the liberation of Western France and the road to Paris. The German response came quickly, but scattered. They laid mine traps, reinforced bocage with denser soil, staged ambushes behind false gaps. In some spots, they added posts or concrete to stiffen the walls. But the speed, scale, and surprise of the Rhino offensive rendered most of these countermeasures ineffective. Some German units had to reconfigure entirely, moving anti-tank weapons to new angles of approach. But most of these adjustments only delayed, not reversed, the Allied advance. On the human level, the Rhino's success brought both joy and challenge. Soldier morale lifted, infantry saw a way through, tank crews feared less for their underbelly, and commanders could draft bolder plans without sacrificing whole platoons to hedgerow traps. In field tents, stories of the mechanic from New Jersey, no longer dismissed as crazy, were shared with pride and gratitude. When Kulin received his medal, he smiled modestly. To him, the award was just a gesture. What mattered was that every time a Rhino rolled forward, more lives had a chance to make it home. But not every outcome was positive. The new momentum put immense pressure on supply chains. Fuel, ammo, tires, tracks, and spare parts had to be delivered fast. Some units, emboldened by breakthrough success, launched attacks before their logistics caught up, leading to fuel or ammo shortages mid-push, forcing them to stall in unstable ground. As a result, some medical and repair crews burned out. Medics saw new injury patterns: burns from shrapnel, trauma from rough terrain, and even friendly fire due to poor visibility in the dust and chaos. The Rhino design itself didn't stay static. It improved with each day of combat. Frontline crews requested central prongs for thicker hedgerows, serrated edges to grip roots, shields to protect welds from shrapnel, and self-cleaning mechanisms so prongs wouldn't jam between successive walls. Army engineers worked with field teams to standardize these upgrades, turning a one-off fix into a mass-producible and maintainable system, a key reason it scaled so rapidly and reliably across Allied tanks. Symbolically, the Rhino came to represent ingenuity and a make-it-work spirit, a reminder that sometimes the practical, rugged solution beats grand plans. When generals recorded their accounts, Eisenhower, Bradley, and others cited the Rhino as a testament to soldier creativity. Few knew the humble New Jersey mechanic behind it. But on every shredded bocage field, on every tactical map where the arrows surged faster each day, Cullen's fingerprints were unmistakable. As winter came, and the battlefield shifted away from the hedgerow country, the steel prongs were gradually removed, stored, or repurposed. But their legacy, etched not only into the soil of France but into military doctrine, endures. A small invention in a massive war, its impact outmatched many guns. It shortened campaigns, saved lives, and changed the mindset of commanders, proving that sometimes the answer to a complex problem lies in a solid weld and the right idea at the right time. When the war ended, America was filled with fireworks and parades. Generals returned to cheers, heroes were praised in the papers, and factories lit up again for peacetime production. But among the crowds coming home, no one noticed a thin man in an old coat, carrying a small suitcase. Curtis G. Cullen, Jr. stepped off the train in New Jersey, as quietly as he had left. No cameras, no interviews, just the smell of engine oil and the whistle of an old train welcoming him back to ordinary life. He reopened the small auto shop where he'd worked before the war. To the neighbors, he was simply Cullen, the best mechanic in town. They had no idea that these same hands had built the weapon that cleared the way for the Allied army. Cullen never called himself a hero. When someone asked what he did during the war, he'd just smile softly. "I fixed tanks." He never talked about St. Lo, never mentioned Bradley or Eisenhower, never spoke of nights welding under falling bombs. Maybe because, to him, none of that mattered anymore. He didn't do it for glory. He did it for the men inside those Shermans, men he knew, men who might survive because of one idea at the right time. His post-war life was as simple as he was. He still drove the same old truck, still ate lunch with black coffee and cold sandwiches, still fixed cars for neighbors at laughably low prices. Occasionally, a veteran would stop by, recognize the name on the sign, shake his hand, and thank him. He'd just nod, smile, and return to the open engine in front of him. In 1963, Curtis G. Cullen passed away at the age of 48. His obituary was just a few short lines. Curtis G. Cullen, Jr., mechanic, veteran. No one knew this man had helped change the course of World War II. He was buried in a small hometown cemetery. No monument, no military honors. Just a plain stone etched with his name and the years he lived. But for the soldiers who rode those Sherman rhinos through Normandy, that name meant something else. It belonged to the man who helped them get home. Decades passed, and history began to forget him. But then, historians started to recover the small, lost stories of war. When they traced back the technical records of the 2nd Armored Division, they found Cullen's name beside a short line, "Invented hedgerow cutter." And from that, the name came back to life. In museums across the US and France, Sherman rhinos were restored. 4 rusty steel prongs jutting forward, rough, sturdy, just like the man who made them. Visitors stand before them, reading a small plaque. Bocage hedgerow cutter, invented by Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, Jr., United States, 1944. Nothing more is needed. Today, when people speak of the Normandy landings, they remember Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, and other great generals. But somewhere, in the margins of history books, there's still the name of a mechanic, the man who turned enemy scrap into a road to freedom. His invention didn't just save lives. It proved the limitless power of human creativity in the face of adversity. Curtis Cullen didn't win with a gun, but with intelligence. Not by command, but by believing. If something doesn't work, we'll make it work. And that belief opened the path to victory.